We are now live.
We're live now, thank you. We're live, everybody, thank you.
Thank you. So the meeting, can I call the meeting to order then?
Yes, thank you.
All right, Michelle, can't find the notes because everything has been screwed up in my system. So why don't you, anything I need to say before we start?
Okay, so we're welcoming everybody.
Yep. First, it's our first meeting of the committee. And obviously this committee is gonna hopefully come up with some interesting ideas and plans. But the idea today is to, all of us to get a debriefing on sort of the baseline case, and then we'll talk about kind of whether it's campus planning, facilities and planning, strategic things, real estate. We'll obviously hone that in as we go forward. So thank you for all serving on the committee. I think I see Margot Vahid, and I think that's it, right? All of us are here in terms of the committee members.
Mike McNally is there also?
Yeah, I said Mike McNally, Mike Vahid and Margot. Mike, the official committee is what, Mike Vahid and I?
Yep.
Yeah.
Margot thinks so. Okay, so thank you all, and why don't we begin?
Okay, what is the first order of business?
So we are beginning with an introduction. So as of right now, you've introduced all of the committee members. And we're going to move to agenda item number 2, which is discussion. And we're going to turn this over to Abby Ryder, who will talk about the overview of URI's current holdings.
Correct, thanks so much. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. I'm going to share screen. There you go. And just let me know if you can see that. Can you see that?
I can see it now, yep.
Yep. Okay, great. Okay, thanks. So what I thought I would do, and this is really just background for the benefit of the committee, is kind of take you through the framework in which we operate as far as real estate transactions go. The Board of Trustees holds title to certain real estate in trust for the state. And it says right in the article that formed the board that the board shall be vested with a legal title to all property, real and personal, now owned by or under the control or in the custody of the Council on Post-Secondary Education, which then for the use of University of Rhode Island. So all of those assets were transferred to the board. Okay, and the board is empowered to hold and operate the property in trust for the state, to acquire, hold, and dispose of the property and other like property as deemed necessary for the execution of its corporate purposes. And it is the successor to all the powers and rights, et cetera, formerly belonging to the Council on Post-Secondary Education and the Governors for Higher Education. So, so that is the authority that the board holds over the real estate. URI holds nearly 25% of the state's buildings. You can see here that the Department of Higher Education as a global unit, holds, I'll get there, yeah, holds about 35% of all of the buildings in the state. So one of the things that I think you've probably heard me say in testimony to the state legislature many times is, you know, we have about 25% of the assets, but we certainly don't get 25% of the RICAP. We get about somewhere between 9 or 10% of the RICAP. So that's something I'm constantly reminding them of, that we've got all these assets, and but we don't get all of the support that one would expect. We are subject to regulation by the State Properties Committee, as is every quasi public and public agency in the state. This was established by 3762A. The members of this committee are a chair appointed by the director of the Department of Administration, the Attorney General, who's ex officio, and 2 members representing the public appointed by the governor with advice and consent of the Senate for 3-year terms. So unless exempted by law, the State Properties Committee rules and regulations apply to all departments, boards, bureaus, commissions, and agencies of the state for all matters over which the State Properties Committee has jurisdiction by statute or by practice. So in effect, basically all of our real estate transactions are subject to the review by the State Properties Committee. I think we've shown you this slide before, but I wanted to remind you that the approvals required for real estate transactions are pretty complicated. A facilities use agreement, that's where people come on our premises and go off, and they don't inhabit them, they use them for a short period of time. Up to 1 year is approval, can be approved by the president. Small leases can be approved by the president and the State Properties Committee. Larger leases, that is with a tenure of greater than a year, must go to State Properties. 5,000 square feet or more must go to State Properties. And those are consistent throughout all these other categories, including acquisition of properties and disposition of properties. However, note that any lease or rental agreement that is greater than 5 years with an aggregate rent over the total terms, that's the original term and the extended terms of the lease, requires approval directly by the General Assembly. So that means that a big lease, is a complicated process because it has to fit into the legislative cycle.
Abby, how many times does that happen? Like, what is that a frequent thing or?
Yeah, we haven't. Let's see. Oh, Ryan, you know the exact ones,
Yeah,
right?
last year alone, we had 2 of them that were leases for in our Independence Square building.
That the aggregate was more than 500,000.
Correct.
And
So some years we don't have any,
and-
other years we have multiple. Kind of it ebbs and flows.
So on those, you literally have to wait through the whole legislative cycle to get it approved. The proceeds of the sale of state real estate assets go not to the selling agency, but to the state's Information Technology Investment Fund. This was something that the legislature thought up as a way to fund some of the big enterprise systems that the state needed. And so, for example, at the moment, we are an occupant in the Shepherd Building in Providence. The state's very anxious to sell it, and there are really 2 reasons for that. I'm speculating, but I'll speculate. One is that the building needs maintenance and is not really well suited to the uses that are in it. And the other is that the sale of the building would produce proceeds that would help the state to pay for the big ERP conversion that they are facing, as are we, because their systems are very outdated and they need to upgrade them. So the point is, the sale of real estate assets is a difficult venue. I mean, we might be able to get them to agree that they would give us the proceeds back after we sold the asset, but it's just simply selling assets is probably not one of the more useful methods of using the real estate that we have. Uniquely, Rhode Island's public institutions of higher education can enter into very long ground leases. You'll see this is lease or sale of land. It's our IGL 3775, and the second bullet is the important one. The Rhode Island Board of Governors, now the Board of Trustees in our case, and the Board of Education in the case of Rick and CCRI, may enter into ground leases for real property owned by the board for up to 99 years with 499 renewal periods. So that, I did the math, I think it's 495 years, right? Each for educational and other purposes consistent with the mission of the institution. So that was a special exception that was made for actually a transaction that the university wanted to do, but it continues, and what that means is that it is possible for us to do long ground leases. Which might be a useful tool in terms of various projects that we might want to carry out.
We are still limited to the 10+10 for the lease of buildings.
Right, for the lease of buildings.
Yes.
But ground,
The ground,
no,
we have that.
we can
longer.
do that exception, okay? The State Properties Committee strongly prefers the use of a competitive process for soliciting interest from potential lessees. So for example, if we wanted to do a ground lease, it's not clear that we're absolutely required to have some kind of RFP, but it is actually likely that it would be frowned upon if we didn't, or we would receive some pressure to do that. So That's just something to keep in mind, that some of these transactions that we might want to undertake, we would probably be urged strongly by the State Properties Committee to have a competitive process. Now I want to talk a little bit about our debt structure, just so you understand that. We have general obligation bonds, and those are actually obligations of the state, not the university. The amount of annual debt service for GO bonds allocated to URI capital projects is shown as a state appropriation, that is shown as revenue to the university in the state budget, but then it comes out again exactly the same amount as an expense, as in our expense section. And the reason they do that, I think, is more for tracking purposes, and so that they can track, how many of the bonds were issued for the benefit of URI and how much is that costing the state. And of course, the latest and greatest revenue bond, GO bond, is the $100 million bond for the Phase 2 Narragansett Bay campus renovation. Revenue bonds are the obligation of the university, and there are different indentures or security agreements attached to that debt. Education in general is secured by a pledge of URI's and education in general revenues, which we also call Fund 100 or state revenues, like the state appropriation, tuition fees, etc. The auxiliary revenues, auxiliary bonds or indentures are secured by a pledge of the auxiliary revenues, housing, dining, health services, bookstore, and Memorial Union. They actually have different ratings. Our E&G rating by Moody's is AA3. State of Rhode Island is AA2, just for comparison purposes. And the auxiliary rating by Moody's is A1. So those have been used historically for utilities and other infrastructure investments in the E&G side, and for all kinds of auxiliary needs on the auxiliary side, predominantly housing and other facilities that are delivering services to students. And then we do have about $17.5 million of certificates of participation that were issued by the state specifically for energy conservation improvements, but it's a small amount and it's sort of self-amortizing. The savings pay for it. So our revenue bonds outstanding, just so you know, we have 247 million approximately outstanding. That's the principal balance of bonds as of June 30th, 2022. Most of that is auxiliary, 186 of it is auxiliary, and 61 of it is education in general. Revenues are pledged to the revenue bond debt service. So that means that in order to issue additional bonds under the indentures or parity debt outside the indentures, that is to say, debt that is issued on a parity with those revenues, require certain certifications and tests to be met. The most notable one is there's a negative covenant that says that we will not issue debt on the E&G side if our debt service coverage is less than 1, and on the auxiliary side if it's less than 1.2. Subordinate debt secured by those revenues can be issued without limitation. So if we have a lender who's willing to subordinate to that pledge of revenues, then we can issue debt in that way. Under the indentures, additional debt that is not secured by the revenues is permitted. So, for example, if we wanted to acquire new real estate and we wanted to put a mortgage on it, we could do that. And it would not be subordinate to the pledge of the revenues for the bonds, because it's a new asset and it's a new separate piece of debt. What we couldn't do is issue new debt on an existing project that had been financed by revenue bonds, because then we would have the problem, that debt would have to be subordinated to the indenture. So that's kind of where we sit with our debt structure. Kushner authorizations. According to RIGL 3818-1, the General Assembly must provide its consent to the issuance or incurring by the state of Rhode Island and other public agencies of any obligations, including revenue bonds issued by state entities, as distinct from general obligation bonds. They don't oblige us to issue the debt, but they make it possible to incur the obligation during a 5-year window. They're good for 5 years. Thus, our debt issuance plans tend to run on an annual cycle that coincides with the legislative calendar. It also, it makes us less agile because we have to wait through the legislative cycle to get the cushion to issue the debt. Last year, we asked for a cushion or authorization for student housing late in the session. And we had to spend a lot of chips to do that. We were criticized for doing that, but of course, what we were responding to was the pressure that had arisen during the pandemic on housing, which became fully apparent in about March of last year. So that's why the late request. But the legislature counts that as an ask, even though we're paying the debt. Okay. And then talking about the rating agencies, Moody's view of P3s. This is important because it kind of dictates what structure we might ever use on a public-private partnership. Project debt and equity associated with the partnership are generally included in adjusted debt. They create an adjusted debt for the institution if the following three conditions are met. The project primarily serves university constituents. The project is located on land owned by the university and falls under a long-term contractual agreement, such as a ground lease. And the ownership of the project reverts back to the university at the conclusion of the contractual agreement. So in addition to P3 financings, their adjusted debt also includes our direct debt, operating leases, and also our 3-year adjusted net pension liability. They look at the adjusted liability, which is calculated in our financial statements, and they add that in. So those are all the factors that are affecting our ratings, and it does mean that whereas before many public-private partnerships were considered off credit, it's getting increasingly more difficult to get a P3 to be considered off credit. It can be done, and we're going to be talking about some of those later, but they every time something new happens in the market that causes some kind of difficulty or hardship with a P3, they tighten up their criteria for what's on credit and what's off credit. Margot, did you have a question?
Yeah, this is probably more for Mike, or Vahid. Is the third element of this, maybe Abby, is the third requirement typical where the ownership of the project reverts back to the university? Would that be expected by a private partnership?
Yeah, they usually are, and usually that's because they're built on university land, and the university is not willing to part with the land. And so they have to figure out some way for the partner to exit at the end of the deal. And usually what happens is that the asset comes back to the university because you can't move it.
But I think, Margot, the real estate developer would be happy to not do that. But, candidly, generally these are all leases that go for a long time. They go back. So if there was a 99-year lease or a 49-year lease, at the end, the university get the land, owns the land, they contribute the land. So these things make it tougher to do, Abby, now, because used to be you could contribute the land and then you would never have any response for the debt, even if the university would serve that. So they made it, the agency seemed like they're making it tougher to get off balance financing.
Right, and one of the reasons for that is, interestingly, a number of examples popped up during the pandemic, but probably the most notable was that the University of Georgia had a bunch of student housing that was a P3. And of course, during the pandemic, they had to de-densify. When they de-densified, the revenue from students went down. And so the partner stopped maintaining the buildings. They reduced their staff in the buildings and they stopped taking care of the buildings. And they basically just said, we're not going to do it because we don't have the revenue. And it wound up that the University of Georgia was downgraded because of those P3s, because of course they stepped in. They weren't going to leave their students in buildings that weren't being properly operated. So that immediately caused the rating agencies to sharpen their pencils about, okay, under what circumstances, really what they're trying to judge is at what point will the university step in regardless of what the contract says. That's really the risk they're evaluating. And if you have students who are trying to survive the pandemic and they're in a building that's half empty and nobody's there, cleaning it ever or whatever. I don't know what the specifics of the situation were. The university is likely to decide at that point that, they can't just leave the students there in that situation. So that's why things have gotten more difficult. And they have, Mike, you're absolutely right. They have. So, most of you know all of this, but there are three types of P3s really. There's the availability payment P3. So that means after building it, the private developer is entitled to payments from the university as long as contract conditions are fulfilled, which might be operating performance requirements that they have to meet, and it might be capital maintenance that they have to meet. Those are set by negotiation with the developer. There's a demand risk P3 or a concession. In that case, you basically give the developer a concession to operate housing on your campus, for example, or parking on your campus. They keep the revenue and they take all of the revenue risk. That was the kind that Georgia had, and it blew up on them when the pandemic hit. And then there are hybrids, so with an availability based component and a demand risk component. And so basically it's a continuum. And if you think about a P3, there's DBFOM. So that is design, build, operate, finance, maintain. And all of those components can be shifted. The risk of those components can be shifted to one party or the other, depending on which party is best suited to assume the risk. And so, for example, one thing that our housing people have made very clear is regardless of what structure we use on our next housing project, they want to be in charge of the programming. That is to say, the activities in the residence hall, the resident advisors who live in the halls,
Room assignments.
And room assignments, correct, right. So those are all things that you negotiate. Vahid.
Sorry, Abby, I'm trying to figure out how to raise my hand on that thing. But have we been approached in the last few years or whatever by entities outside to as far as certain kinds of P3s, whether it's for maintenance, whether for its operation, anything like that? Because it's fairly common. It's happening all over the place now. Many companies are doing this, right?
Right.
So
we have had conversations. I wouldn't say any of them advanced too far. We had some conversations about utilities, right?
Right.
And of course, we are actually in the process right now of putting together an RFP that will allow proposals for housing, okay, which is an obvious one for a university. Other than that, I don't think I can't think of others where we've had an actual, a firm come in. I mean, it was
Years
But
ago.
Abby, didn't you have a
Meridian came in. Meridian was here. That was several years ago. Yeah.
yeah, I have to recuse myself anything to do with Meridian, so because I know too many people there. So we used to own it. So
Okay. All right.
But Dooley was gonna do, maybe it was with Meridian, but Dooley about 5 years ago or so it was a big one, I thought, on the Bay campus.
That was Meridian.
Yeah.
We're talking to Meridian about it. Yeah.
Yep.
And one of the things that generally happens is if a partner like that generally wants to either control whatever it is they're partnering on completely, or they don't want to take enough risk to make it attractive. So that I know on the Bay campus, the problem was there are old buildings and new buildings. They didn't want the old buildings, they just wanted the new buildings, right? So that's another thing where sometimes it's better to do them, one at a time, one thing at a time.
So
And
Abby,
we'll
the
discuss that
university
further.
has never done any P3s to date?
No, we have not.
But I mean, like Mike McNally for me, this, I was on the Port Authority board, LaGuardia Airport's renovation was done in a
That was,
P3.
URS did that one, yeah.
So, and that was, and then partly was to get the cost risk shared and off the, get it done on time and on the private hand. So like, there's a lot of reasons people have done these, but I think we'd have to look at a specific situation to see if it makes sense, because obviously some people did off balance sheet, some did it to control costs, some did it to share ongoing maintenance and what the bead said. So there's a lot of different models of this, but if we've never done one, we'd have to find a situation which really warranted doing one.
I'll add this is Ryan Carrillo, I'll add that if you read some newspaper reports, the Nursing Education Center was referred to as a P3, but it really
wasn't really.
It wasn't really, it was just Rhode Island News referred to it as such because we were coming in and leasing space from a private entity, but it was really just a straight building lease.
Yeah, it was a ground lease, and then it was a building was built on the ground lease, and then we leased some space in the building, that's all, yeah. So that's sort of my introductory remarks. I think after that, we'll be going into executive session, correct? I covered mine, yeah.
All of this?
Yeah, covered debt
Discussion.
structure, yeah, and the covenants, yeah.
Yeah. Unless I can ask questions.
So does anyone have questions on this background material before we go into executive session? Oh,
Abby, is it clear that it's legal in the state of Rhode Island?
It's very interesting. Basically, it is absolutely allowed, except for some reason, the Department of Transportation, right? And they're looking to get legislation passed to permit them also to do P3s.
Yeah, I was on a committee maybe 3 years ago where the state looked into it and it didn't survive.
Yeah.
But we can talk about that.
Yeah, okay.
Abby, one going back to be helpful for the baseline case is that, we have all the square footage, what's leased, what's the state, I don't know what you're gonna cover later, but what's the state of our facilities, one by one, each department, what state of good repair are they in, how we might evaluate that, rank them. Ryan does this when he does his capital planning looking forward. So that's going to be important, I think, for this committee to get a baseline case. These are more transactional things you've talked about with regulations in place on financing and leasing. But I'm talking about like getting a handle on what we've got, what kind of conditions in, what needs work, what the amount of money, time frame, all of that, so we can get a baseline case of that.
Sure, Mike, and in fact, that's in the works as we speak, and we're doing building condition assessments across the campus.
Right.
In very broad strokes, there's a lot of deferred maintenance on our real estate.
Right.
If you look at it this way, the depreciation in our financial statement is around $40 million a year. We get about $8 million of RICAP a year, maybe 10 in a good year. So you can tell right there that we're behind. And we estimate just by taking all the building systems, figuring out what their useful life is, and then figuring out how far past their useful life, we think we have a deferred maintenance bill, easily $260 million, maybe more, okay? Now, some of that has been addressed by replacing buildings with new buildings. And that certainly will be the case, for example, on the Bay campus, where the Horn Laboratory building is completely, it's not only completely depreciated, it's completely used up, right? And so those, we take care of some of the backlog by replacing buildings, but we do have generally, a lot of deferred maintenance, and we don't have enough operating budget because as President Perlage has so ably, demonstrated and shown with the various graphs, we have been underfunded for 20 years easily.
Right.
And one of the things that has suffered has been just having an operating budget allocated to maintenance of buildings.
Right.
So, but we will certainly share with the committee as those building condition assessments are completed, we will share with the committee the details of that.
Okay, do we need a motion to go into executive session, Michelle?
Yes, we do.
Can I get a motion to do that? Mike?
Oh, yeah,
So move.
and
Or
I'll
second. Yeah.
Okay, great. Then let's move into executive session. Go ahead.
Okay, so we're going to pause until we go into the breakout session.
We're gonna have to press anything?
You'll be prompted on the computer screen, otherwise it'll move you right over if you don't.
Here, how's that? Okay, we're off mute. I unmuted it.
I can hear you.
Muted itself.
And we're back live.
But it seems like
Mike, you're on mute.
everybody's on mute.
Can you unmute that one?
I'm muting. Can you hear me now?
Perfect.
Yes, yes.
Okay. Can I get a motion to seal the executive session minutes, Mike?
So moved.
Thank you. Okay, the meeting's a seal. The next motion I want to take is just get a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Thank you. All right, then. Thank you guys for that. Abby, can you come back maybe in an email and give us an idea when you could give us some information to put down, and we'll schedule another meeting?
Sure, I'd be glad to.
That'd be great. Okay, thank
That's
you.
great.
Hey,
Yeah,
Mike?
good meeting. Yes, Mike.
Are you around? Can I give you a call? I just brainstorm